So, my first memory of going through a crisis on my own as an adult was when I totaled my car in college. In the tiny town where I went to college, there were, I think, four traffic lights. And one of them was a normal traffic light during the day, but switched to flashing red in one direction and flashing yellow in the other direction at night. Although in my head, it switched to flashing red in every direction at night. And so that night, as I was driving my friend and her bike home to the apartment house that we lived in, I approached the flashing red side, assuming that the other car that I saw coming in the other direction also had a flashing red and would also stop. And as I stopped and then began to move into the intersection, I realized that they weren't stopping. And in that short moment, what I remember is screaming really loudly, bracing myself, and glass shattering, all of the glass of the car shattering. And then the moment was over, and I checked to see if my friend was okay, and she was. I briefly checked myself to make sure that I was still alive, and I was. And I drove my car forward a few dozen feet to get out of the intersection. All of my crisis management responses kicked into gear. I was calm. I talked to the other driver and captured his information. I called the police to file a report. I helped my friend get her bike out of my car and told her to just go home. I told the other driver that he could leave even before the police and the tow truck got there because his car was undamaged, although mine was totaled. I talked to the police. I talked to the tow truck guy. I called my parents. And my memory of that phone call is that I said, I'm okay. Everything's okay. But the car is not. And it was only once everyone left, once my car had been towed away, that I felt so shaky that I had to sit down on the curb of the street. It wasn't until the next day that I noticed that I had bruises from the seat belt and soreness in my body that was not noticeable to me at all that night. It wasn't until the next week when I went to the junkyard to retrieve my belongings from the car that I realized that the car that had hit me hadn't just hit the passenger side behind me. They had actually hit the driver's side door, and my seat was tilted up and crooked. That I had been in greater danger than I thought. And it wasn't until I think 10 years later when I went to a chiropractor for some chronic neck pain that they said, you know, it looks from your x rays that you were in a car accident about 10 years ago and you didn't seek treatment then and didn't heal properly. It's kind of amazing what our bodies and our nervous systems can do in crises. We are sort of designed for our automatic nervous systems to take over, for adrenaline to flood our our bodies, so that we can fight or take flight or fawn or play dead. And if that stress continues, if that crisis moment continues and our bodies continue to feel under threat, cortisol begins to take over, another hormone in our body, and we stay on high alert. As a threat disappears, in theory, the parasympathetic division of our body kicks in and allows the cortisol to dissipate, calms our stress response, and we are able to then enter the slower process of recovering from that crisis once we're out of danger. That's my understanding of it anyway, as someone who's entirely non-medical profession, unlike many of you. We're designed to be able to get through those moments of crises, to handle details, to stay upright, to get to the other side of them alive, even if we're injured, so that we can begin to heal once we're out of the danger. But nobody lives in the emergency room, right? We're not meant to stay in that moment of crisis or high stress or danger or threat forever. We need a break from that in order to be able to recover. And if we try to live in the emergency room, if we try or perhaps we're forced to stay in that place where our body's stress, threat, crisis response is on high, over time, that adrenaline and cortisol flowing through our systems can cause chronic health problems, heart disease, high blood pressure, other kinds of havoc on our bodies. If we don't learn how to leave the emergency room, our emotional health can suffer too, right? We turn those short-term coping mechanisms into long-term or mid-term coping mechanisms, and they're not designed for that. For example, I remember that I totally ignored I don't think that I could have been in touch with what my body was really feeling that night of the car accident. That didn't come until the next day. But if I'm never in touch with the way my body feels, over weeks and months and years, I get into really bad trouble, right? Or sometimes we rely on distraction habits or numbing habits. Sometimes they're just a momentary indulgence of alcohol or drugs or junk food. But over this midterm, over the long term, those momentary indulgences can turn into chronic destructive habits in our lives. And sometimes we harm relationships in our lives by leaning too heavily on those unhealthy coping habits, those ways of shutting people out of our lives in order to just get through that moment of crisis ends up leaving us without community if we do that for too long of a period of time. Or we bond too tightly with someone who treats us badly because there is something that feels comforting about that close bond, and we end up in an abusive, longer-term relationship. So what do we do? What do we do in the kinds of situations that we have all been in this past year when a moment of crisis drags out into weeks or months or now almost a year of a long-term struggle? I remember in those first few days and weeks of the pandemic, almost a year ago now, I wouldn't say that I was in good shape. I was definitely not in good shape, but I was using all of my short-term crisis skills. My memory, anyway, and maybe those of you who remember what I was like at that point can tell me that I'm wrong, but my memory of what I was like back then was that I felt calm, was that I felt alert, and that I immediately went into planning mode. Reverend Hannah and I spent a lot of time in those first few days as we saw the pandemic coming, or we didn't understand what even that meant at that time. And after we had to shut down, talking to everyone in the congregation we could think of who could help us plan and pivot congregational life into virtual congregational life. We talked to those of you who work in medicine professions about disease vectors and how to minimize the possibility that we would become a source of an outbreak. We talked to those of you who work in tech about internet speeds and how to create Zoom worship. And those of you who work in theater and who work in the more technical side of music about how to make worship feel emotionally connective, even though we were shifting to a virtual format. And Hannah and I spent lots of time about talking about what was most important in congregational life and how we could continue that virtually, talking about how we could make sure that we were prioritizing intimacy with one another and connection and care, and how we could continue to speak to the moment, even as this moment was a moment of crisis. We drew on everything and everyone we knew to be able to get through that crisis moment. But then it continued, right? and continued and continued. I remember in that time that every time I ventured out of my house, even just to get groceries or pick up supplies, it felt dangerous. And it also felt deeply purposeful and emotionally exhausting. And I know that my experience was nothing compared to those of you who work as frontline workers and those of you whose jobs or resources evaporated in that time. What we're experiencing is different from a personal crisis. Usually, in personal crises, we have friends or family or loved ones who are not in crisis who can support us. But this kind of a crisis we have all been going through together. And a lot of those coping mechanisms that are healthy for us, like going to the gym or crying on the shoulder of a friend, haven't been available to us in this pandemic. And those of us who are facing layered crises know that that makes everything harder too, right? Those of us in pandemic plus mode, people who have gone through the ending of important relationships during this time, or who've been dealing with health crises outside of the COVID pandemic, people who have had caretaking responsibilities double and triple and quadruple as other caretakers became unavailable, or who've lost jobs, or who are just simply dealing with multiple oppressions in daily life. Some of you know that we are going to be sharing our offering this afternoon or this morning with the Coalition for Black Trans Economic Liberation. And part of why we're sharing our offering with that group is because of this, the importance of recognizing these kinds of layered crises, that those of us who experience multiple oppressions in addition to a pandemic, in addition to whatever else is happening in our personal lives, so particularly Black and trans folks in this city, have far fewer opportunities to ever get out of that short-term crisis mode, because one crisis will layer on another and on another and on another. And that opportunity to relax out of a crisis is much harder to find. And so I hope that many of you will join us in being generous with that group today as we try to support people who are facing those layered crises in our city right now. I think it was months into the pandemic before I actually began to feel my own feelings and grieve my own grief. And certainly it took a longer time before I began to be able to turn towards sustainable and sustaining habits that could help me cope in a long-term sense with what we've been going through. The transition between coping with a short-term crisis and dealing with a long-term struggle is hard, right? I feel like in the best case scenario, if you survive your short-term crisis without spiraling out, without falling into all of those destructive habits that I just mentioned, the best case is that you're going into having to transition into new coping strategies while being completely exhausted from coping with that crisis. That's best case. Worst case, you find yourself maybe through the short-term struggle, but with irreparable damage done to yourself or to your relationships or other sources of stability in your life. You've lost a job, or you've lost loved ones, or you've relapsed into an addiction. Or if you have those layered identities, that you're never allowed to actually really leave the short-term crisis because you go from one short-term crisis to another to another. In all cases, when we are shifting from a short-term crisis to a long-term struggle, we have to change our coping tactics while our resources are really low, right? Whether that's exhaustion or that we have actually lost some of our support networks. Our willpower is maybe gone. Our hope is anemic. And yet we have to put down those bad short-term coping skills and build new resilience strategies without having the emotional resources to really power them. Without an end to the long-term crisis in sight, we still have to live as if we have hope and trust in the future. And some of us find that we can get through these short-term times and then spend years dealing with the ramifications of them. So, our spiritual theme for the month of March is resilience. And whatever your coping strategy is for short term crises, whether you fight or flight or fawn or play dead or manage your way out of short term crises, none of those coping strategies are actually resilience strategies. None of those actually bring long term resilience into our lives. Long term struggles require such a deeper set of coping skills and an ability to unhook ourselves from that stress cycle. So, I want to share just some of the things that have come to mind for me and come out of conversations I've had with some of you this week as we've been thinking about what resilience looks like right now. And a couple of the things, the two strategies that feel like they have been the easiest to try to latch onto in this time for me have been presence and purpose. So presence is the strategy of just trying to live one day at a time, trying to let go of expectations for what comes next or expectations that we have any control over what's happening now, and just be present to whatever is happening right now. Remembering that it hasn't always been like this, it won't always be like this, and all that we need to do is be present to today. As Martin and I were talking and planning this service, I was thinking that in some ways, talking about being present as a resilient strategy just feels like chopping up long-term crises into little day-by-day segments. But I think it's actually much deeper than that. The ability to be present to every moment is a strategy that can carry us through all of the best and all of the worst in our lives, and is something that we need to return to all the time. All the time. It's also one of the easiest things to return to when our emotional resources are really, really low. It's just like, okay, just this moment, and just now this moment, now this moment. The other one that I feel like we've focused on a lot as a congregation, and I know I think about a lot, is trying to be in touch with some deeper purpose when life feels completely out of control, when the world turns upside down, trying to be tapped into something deeper that can actually sustain us even through an upside down world. Some of us tap into a higher power or a sense that that some of us call God. Some of us connect to a deep and grounded sense of hope. Some of us just are able to remember the importance of compassion and love that holds us even through the hardest moments of our lives. But somehow retaining a connection to purpose in our lives, finding a way to contribute, finding a way to remember what is most important, is one of the other strategies that can keep us resilient even when a short-term crisis becomes a long-term struggle. The ones that are the coping strategies that are much harder from my perspective to build in the middle of a crisis, a long-term crisis period, are self-awareness and accountability and confidence. So self-awareness is something, for me anyway, that often comes after the thing is over. I can reflect back and be in touch with how I learned, how I grew, but it's hard to actually be fully aware of what's happening in the moment. But some of us actually are pretty good at reflecting and trying to be in touch with ourselves in the midst of the crisis. Maybe you can pair that with a practice of mindfulness or a practice of presence. Accountability goes along with that too, about being honest with ourselves and being in touch with what is hard about each of these moments that we're going through. The final one that I never am able to be in touch with until something is over and done with is a renewed sense of confidence. So trusting that we are capable of much more than we give ourselves credit for. Being confident that we have within us what we need to get through anything that life throws at us. I never feel confident in the middle of a long-term crisis. But I find that after that crisis has waned a bit, I learned something important about the resources within me that have carried me through. And my confidence is boosted. Today is the 14th anniversary of my father's death, and about 2 years after my father died, I went through a divorce as well. And what I know is that before I went through my father's illness and death, before I went through the ending of that marriage, I would have told you that I wasn't capable of surviving that level of loss. Certainly not back to back. I would have doubted that I had the strength to survive those experiences. I wouldn't have known what kind of person I could possibly be on the other side of that loss. But what I found after going through them, because you can't actually control the loss you experience in life, when I found that I was on the other side of that level of loss, I found that I had grown. I found that I had learned new things about myself. I had greater clarity about myself. And I believed in myself in a way that I had never truly believed in myself before. I earned that resilience in that time. And having earned resilience through difficulty, we find that we are, that it can't be taken away from us anymore. So I want to invite those of you who have been reflecting on resilience in your own lives, if you have a moment and want to type into the chat something that you have discovered deeply about yourself as we've had to cope in new ways this year. What's something that you have learned about yourself that no one can take away from you at this point in your life? Nothing? Oh, here we go. All right. I am not my failures. I'm optimistic that grief can be truly sometimes love persevering. Learned how to live alone, that I can be alone. Yes, so much of what we've learned is how to be alone. That I will survive, that I'm stronger than I ever thought I was, that I'm capable, that I'm a survivor, that I'm smarter than I thought, that no one can crush the love of my life. The power of habits, my passion for learning, that I'm more independent than I thought, that I like my own company, that my joy is radical and not naive, that I love organizing people's pent-up energy, that humans are resilient, that I can always rely on my siblings, that I will be okay, and I'm how my daughter will learn how to be a strong person, that my spouse and I can weather things together, that I don't need to please everyone, No one can crush my love of life. How important nature is. That I have community. Yeah. If you asked me before this pandemic if I could survive or cope for a year without seeing people in person, if I could lead an entire life behind a computer screen, hidden away in a one-window room in my house, if I could survive a year without hugs or holding hands or singing with other people, I think I would have told you that I couldn't do it. I would have believed that I would spiral and collapse into the worst of myself. And yet, my friends, here we are, almost a year into this upside down world experience that we're sharing. And we found that we are good company. And we found that we are survivors. And we found new ways to connect and even some gifts of this new way of connecting with one another. I would never wish the kind of loss of loved ones on anyone that we've all been experiencing this year. I would never wish the death of a loved one or divorce on anyone. And yet I am so grateful for the lessons of resilience I learned by going through those experiences. So my friends, as we are coming up on this anniversary of the weirdest year, as we are coming up on a year of life behind our screens, my prayer is that each one of us is able to be in touch with those deep resources within us that make us resilient, because each one of us has them. Each one of us has learned something about our own ability to survive in this time. May your ability to survive, may your ability to be self-aware, to be present, to be in touch with your purpose, in touch with your confidence, and to be honest with yourself, carry you through whatever is left of this tunnel that we are in. And may we find ourselves more resilient on the other side. Amen, and blessed be.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abbey Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abbey just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.